A couple of years ago, I think when I was still truck driving, actually, I downloaded the audiobook version of Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Classic book. Every American should read it. That was my thought when I downloaded it. I put it off till recently. So I started listening to it today. Finally got around to it. And I have to say, it kind of blew me away. I definitely didn't expect to draw the conclusion that I have. And for full disclosure, I haven't finished the book yet. So take all this with a grain of salt for the time being. But it still might be some interesting food for thought for people who are nominally on the right, who value family, tradition, conserving Western civilization, as we sometimes call it. It's sort of a nebulous term, but we all know what we're talking about when we say Western civilization. So, modern conservatives and traditionalists like to blame things like Wilsonian globalism or cultural Marxism. We just call it Marxism. Sounds less conspiratorial. I think Sargon's right on that point. Or some outgrowth of the 20th or even the 21st century. They blame Hegel. They blame, whoever. They blame the neocons. And what's shocking is that when you actually read Democracy in America, you see that the foundations for the destruction of our culture were there at the very beginning. And this is sort of a longer quote, but I'd like to read at length a portion of de Tocqueville's work here, the portion that I went back and re-listened to 5 times over because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He says, quote, "At the period of which we are now speaking, society was shaken to its center. The people, in whose name the struggle had taken place, conceived the desire of exercising the authority which it had acquired. Its democratic tendencies were awakened, and having thrown off the yoke of the mother country, it aspired to independence of every kind. The influence of individuals gradually ceased to be felt, and custom and law united together to produce the same result. But the law of descent was the last step to equality. I am surprised that ancient and modern jurists have not attributed to this law a greater influence on human affairs." And his footnote reads, "I understand by the law of descent all those laws whose peripheral object is to regulate the distribution of property after the death of its owner. The law of entail is of this number. It certainly prevents the owner from disposing of his possessions before his death, but this is solely with the view of preserving them entire for the heir. The principal object, therefore, of the law of entail is to regulate the descent of property after the death of its owner. Its other provisions are merely means to this end." That's the end of the footnote. So, to interject here, what he's talking about are laws that either regulate or free people, any laws pertaining to the passing on of wealth from one generation to the next for property. And anyone who's read Letter to Onway will immediately, I think, know where this might be going. But anyways, to continue from where we were. It is true that these laws belong to civil affairs, but they ought nevertheless to be placed at the head of all political institutions. For, whilst political laws are only the symbol of a nation's condition, they exercise an incredible influence upon its social state. They have, moreover, a sure and uniform manner of operating upon society, affecting, as it were, generations yet unborn. Through their means, man acquires a kind of preternatural power over the future of his fellow creatures. When the legislator has regulated the law of inheritance, he may rest from his labor. The machine once put in motion will go on for ages, advance as if self-guided towards a given point. When framed in a particular manner, this law unites, draws together, and vests property and power in a few hands. Its tendency is clearly aristocratic. On opposite principles, its action is still more rapid. It divides, distributes, and disperses both property and power. Alarmed by the rapidity of its progress, those who despair of arresting its motion endeavor to obstruct it by difficulties and impediments. They vainly seek to counteract its effect by contrary efforts. But it gradually reduces or destroys every obstacle, until by its incessant activity the bulwarks of the influence of wealth are ground down to the fine and shifting sand which is the basis of democracy. When the law of inheritance permits, still more when it decrees, the equal division of a father's property amongst all his children, its effects are of two kinds. It is important to distinguish them from each other, although they tend to the same end. In virtue of the law and partible inheritance, the death of every proprietor brings about a kind of revolution in property. Not only do his possessions change hands, but their very nature is altered, since they are parceled into shares, which become smaller and smaller at each division. This is the direct and, as it were, the physical effect of the law. It follows, then, that in countries where equality of inheritance is established by law, property, and especially landed property, must have a tendency to perpetual diminution. The effects, however, of such legislation would only be perceptible after a lapse of time, if the law was abandoned to its own working. For supposing the family to consist of 2 children, and in a country people, as France is, the average number is not above 3, these children, sharing among them the fortune of both parents, would not be poorer than their father or mother. But the law of equal division exercises its influence not merely upon the property itself, but it affects the minds of the heirs, and brings their passions into play. And just to interject here, interrupt the quote real quickly. The passions is a French term. The exact connotation of this I was introduced to when studying Friedrich Nietzsche, who likes to borrow from French phrases, ressentiment and so forth. And the passions don't just refer to certain emotions. They refer to particular notions, and there's emotions. And there's a negative connotation to these passions. They're when Friedrich Nietzsche quotes the French, the passions must be suppressed. They're referring to greed, lust, the excesses. But in any case, we'll get to that in a second. Continuing the quote. These indirect consequences tend powerfully to the destruction of large fortunes, and especially of large domains. Among nations whose law of descent is founded upon the right of primogeniture, landed estates often pass from generation to generation without undergoing division, the consequence of which is that family feeling is to a certain degree incorporated with the estate. The family represents the estate, the family, whose name, together with its origin, its glory, its power, and its virtues, is thus perpetuated in an imperishable memorial of the past and a sure pledge of the future. When the equal partition of property is established by law, the intimate connection is destroyed between family feeling and the preservation of the paternal estate. The property ceases to represent the family, for as it must inevitably be divided after 1 or 2 generations, it has evidently a constant tendency to diminish and must in the end be completely dispersed. The sons of the great landed proprietor, if they are few in number, or if fortune befriends them, may indeed entertain the hope of being as wealthy as their father, but not that of possessing the same property as he did. The riches must necessarily be composed of elements different from his. Now, from the moment that you divest the landowner of that interest in the preservation of his estate, which he derives from association, from a tradition, and from family pride, you may be certain that sooner or later he will dispose of it, for there is a strong pecuniary interest in favor of selling, as floating capital produces higher interest than real property, and is more readily available to gratify the passions of the moment. Great landed estates, which have once been divided, never come together again. For the small proprietor draws from his land a better revenue in proportion than the large owner does from his, and of course he sells it at a higher rate. And here he has another footnote saying, I do not mean to say that the small proprietor cultivates his land better, but he cultivates it with more ardor and care, so that he makes up by his labor for his want of skill. But anyways, returning to where we were. The calculations of gain, therefore, which decide the rich man to sell his domain, will still more powerfully influence him against buying small estates to unite them into a large one. In other words, paraphrasing here, this encourages the destruction of estates and encourages and also discourages, their reunification. Continuing the quote, and we're getting close to the end here. What is called family pride is often founded upon an illusion of self-love. A man wishes to perpetuate and immortalize himself, as it were, in his great-grandchildren, where the esprit de famille ceases to act. Individual selfishness comes into play. When the idea of family becomes vague, indeterminate, and uncertain, a man thinks of his present convenience. He provides for the establishment of his succeeding generation and no more. I would interject, if that. Either a man gives up the idea of perpetuating his family, or at any rate he seeks to accomplish it by other means than that of a landed estate. Thus, not only does the law of partible inheritance render it difficult for families to preserve their ancestral domains entire, but it deprives them of the inclination to attempt it, and compels them in some measure to cooperate with the law in their own extinction. The law of equal distribution proceeds by two methods. By acting upon things, it acts upon persons. By influencing persons, it affects things. By these means, the law succeeds in striking at the root of landed property and dispersing rapidly both families and fortunes. Most certainly, it is not for us Frenchmen of the 19th century, who daily witness the political and social changes which the law of partition is bringing to pass, to question its influence. It is perpetually conspicuous in our country, overthrowing the walls of our dwellings and removing the landmarks of our fields. But although it has produced great effects in France, much still remains for it to do. Our recollections, opinions, and habits present powerful obstacles to its progress. In the United States, it has nearly completed its work of destruction, and there we can best study its results. The English laws concerning the transmission of property were abolished in almost all the states at the time of the Revolution. The law of entail was so modified as not to interrupt the free circulation of property. The first generation having passed away, estates began to be parceled out, and the change became more and more rapid with the progress of time. At this moment, after a lapse of little more than 60 years, the aspect of society is totally altered. The families of the great landed proprietors are almost all commingled with the general mass. In the state of New York, which formerly contained many of these, there are but two who still keep their heads above the stream, and they must shortly disappear. The sons of these opulent citizens are become merchants, lawyers, or physicians. Most of them have lapsed into obscurity. The last trace of hereditary ranks and distinctions is destroyed. The law of partition has reduced all to one level. I do not mean that there is any deficiency of wealthy individuals in the United States. I know of no country, indeed, where the love of money has taken stronger hold on the affections of men, and where the profounder contempt is expressed for the theory of permanent equality of property. But wealth circulates with inconceivable rapidity, and experience shows that it is rare to find two succeeding generations in the full enjoyment of it. End quote. Now, the critical thing to focus on here is the way in which everyone likes to focus on the money. Everyone likes to focus on the unearned privilege, and I deal with that, I think, in my book, Letter to Amway, which, for those of you who have read In Defense of Hatred, I believe to be a much better book than its preceding book. Not that I don't still agree with all the arguments in Defense of Hatred. I just think it was better written. But that aside, he's not focusing on the money here. What he's focusing on is the subject of identity, family identity specifically. And this is what I tried to focus on in my essay on Christianity and identity, which Sun Society interpreted as, focusing too much on race. And race was just an example. Race, given the choice between a random white stranger and a black friend, I'm going to choose my black friend, every time. We have concentric layers of identity. And at the heart of that is, in my opinion, not the individual. It's the lineage. And the family is the current manifest expression of that lineage. And the individual is a component of that. But by ourselves, we're not the whole thing. We're not the complete organism. And to think that we are is a sort of cancerous mindset, which I believe is what he's alluding to here. When we lose sight of our familial identity, we lose the incentive to maintain what we have inherited and to leave something, to leave an inheritance for those who are going to come after us. And this is the argument also against matriarchies and in favor of patriarchies. If fathers don't know who their sons are, then they lose a lot of the incentives to leave something behind, to leave their society better than they found it, to plant trees whose shade they will never know, as the Greek proverb goes. And so what de Tocqueville is somewhat shockingly pointing out, he might not even know it in doing so, is that the ideological, almost theological foundation for equality and the metaphysical destruction of the possibility of legacy was planted in America from the very beginning. It's not the result of Marxism. It's not the result of globalism. Globalism and Marxism were possible. They were viable in this soil because of the ideological foundation that was already there. The opening to equality, and the idea that children should not have the right, or it was the state's job to step in and say, you aren't allowed to keep your inheritance in one piece. Now, it obviously makes family inheritance a tricky thing. It's, when you think about it, kind of hard to think, well, I'm going to leave my firstborn son with everything and my secondborn son with nothing. The secondborn son goes to the army, my thirdborn son goes to the monastery, or whatever the order happened to be back in the day. It's a tough thing to do when you look at your kids as individuals, and they are individuals too. But from my research and reading, the important thing in life is not happiness. It's not fun. It's about meaning and doing something that matters to you over time. It's contributing and participating in something that is greater than yourself. And the fun is fun, it's good. Fun is good. And being happy is great. It's nice. But you can be extremely happy and feel empty inside. Happy people kill themselves sometimes. They commit suicide because they feel like there's no purpose. There's no there. And even unhappy people can derive a sense of satisfaction that in terms of a life well lived outweighs the positive utility of happiness alone. And that meaning, that underlying meaning and the possibility of it is destroyed when you cut people off from their ancestors and their descendants. And so when you see the destruction of monuments in the South, the taking down of, General Robert E. Lee, or soon General Washington and Thomas Jefferson. They'll come for them too if they haven't already. And replacing these symbols of our ancestors and heritage with new postmodern art, or whatever the current fad is. It's breaking that tie. And it's exactly what de Tocqueville is describing is going on in France, but has already been done more completely in the United States at the time that he's writing this, which is in the early 19th century. And we're into the 21st. The foundations were already there. It's not Marx's fault. It's not President Wilson's fault. It was already there. And so when we go back to the origin of this idea, it brings us back, and this will be extremely uncomfortable for many people, but it brings us back to Christianity. And I think that will be a subject for another video. So, food for thought. And let me know what you think.